In the heart of Geneva, where world leaders bowed to empire, one young African president broke the script, and with 5 fearless words, he shattered centuries of submission. Just as Nelson Mandela once walked free and redefined Africa's pride, Ibrahim Traoré now stands tall, rewriting history for a new generation. The armored convoy slices through Geneva's pristine streets like a blade through silk, carrying Africa's youngest head of state toward a collision with destiny. President Ibrahim Traoré adjusts the Kent cloth sash draped proudly across his crisp military uniform, the vibrant colors of Burkina Faso blazing against the sterile Swiss morning. Behind bulletproof glass, he watches protesters chanting Africa Rising and End Neocolonialism. Their voices echo off ancient stone walls, their signs a reminder that history itself is watching. His security detail moves in perfect formation, yet Traoré's thoughts outpace protocol. He calculates the weight of choices that will shape not just his nation, but an entire continent. This is no ordinary diplomatic summit. It is a battlefield where words strike harder than bullets, and where a single handshake can enslave nations for generations. Inside the fortress-like headquarters of the World Economic Forum, 195 delegates stroll marble corridors lined with portraits of men who once carved Africa into pieces like slices of cake. Stepping from his vehicle, Traoré carries himself with the gravity of a man who sees power not by inheritance or election fraud, but by revolution, born of his people's desperate hunger for sovereignty. Swiss guards snap to attention, their radios buzzing with whispers about the problematic, young African leader who refuses to bow to global order. At just 34, his face bears the lines of sleepless nights and battle scars, of friends buried, and a nation freed long before most world leaders ever learned to compromise their principles. The marble beneath his boots has known both tyrants and liberators. Today, history waits to decide which name will be written beside his. As Traoré enters the grand hall, conversations die mid-sentence. Every eye follows the man who expelled French troops, reclaimed gold mines from American corporations, and dared to lead with African dignity instead of Western approval. His delegation closes ranks behind him. Advisors, chosen not from foreign universities, but from the trenches of Burkina Faso's independence struggle. These are men and women who know that sovereignty cannot be bought with loans or negotiated away in aid packages. Austrian chandeliers spill their glow over his weathered face. Other African presidents nod, some with admiration, others with unease, fearing the unrest his defiance might spark back home. For in this hall, where Africa's wealth has been quietly auctioned for decades, Traoré embodies a nightmare for the powerful, an African leader who truly serves Africa. The room transforms into a theater of power. Protocol officers orchestrate every gesture with military precision. Young aides scurry like sparrows, whispering instructions about handshakes and photo opportunities that will dominate tomorrow's headlines. Months of planning, countless rehearsals, each detail designed to reinforce the invisible chains that have bound Africa for centuries. At the center of it all stands the podium, where Donald Trump waits, flanked by American flags. Here, sovereign presidents are expected to salute and submit in a ritual that masquerades as diplomacy but reeks of empire. Traoré's jaw tightens as he watches African leaders practice their bows, echoes of colonial governors looming over their movements. The protocol book, thick as scripture, dictates every step: approach, salute, handshake, retreat, await dismissal. One by one, presidents from Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa file forward, their expensive suits unable to hide the humiliation of repeating rituals their ancestors once performed before foreign masters. Cameras flash as the images are captured. Submissive salutes broadcast worldwide, narratives of dependence reinforced for another generation. But Traore is different. Swiss guards notice it too, their gaze lingering on him. They can sense the storm building. When his turn is called, the hall tightens like a drum. Trump leans forward, smirk fixed, ready to savor another performance of obedience. Cameras adjust, focusing on the young African president expected to bow like all the rest. Traore rises slowly, his Kent sash catching the light, his boots echoing against marble floors that have carried centuries of Africa's humiliation. His delegation clenches their fists in silent solidarity. Other leaders shift uncomfortably in their seats. The air itself feels electrified. At the designated spot, Traore halts. He does not salute. He does not bow. He stands, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Trump's, unflinching as the silence stretches. The script has been broken. Photographers scramble, shutters firing like gunfire, capturing the instant the chain snaps. Trump's smirk falters. Confusion flickers into irritation. The Swiss organizers flip desperately through their manuals, searching for a response to something they never imagined, an African leader refusing to perform submission. For the first time in that hall, the invisible empire wavers. No leader has ever dared to refuse this ritual of submission. Around the hall, presidents crane their necks, some with horror etched across their faces, others with a flicker of admiration they cannot conceal, admiration for a courage they themselves have never possessed. In that instant, President Ibrahim Traoré ceases to be just another participant in diplomatic theater. He becomes the living author of African dignity. The tension in the chamber thickens until it is almost unbearable. And then, at last, Traoré speaks. His voice carries not just across the marble hall, but across history itself. The voice of a man who freed his people from foreign military bases and, more importantly, from the chains of mental colonization. I salute only the flag of Burkina Faso and the dignity of my people, he declares. The words crash through the silence like thunder rolling across a desert plain. The translator falters, stumbling over the unexpected statement, her voice trembling as she forces revolutionary defiance into the languages of a world utterly unprepared to hear it. Western delegates exchange anxious glances. Their comfortable assumptions about African obedience collapse in real time, tumbling like a house of cards struck by an earthquake. Swiss security steps subtly closer, but Traoré does not move. His refusal to salute becomes not a disruption, but a masterclass in sovereignty that refuses to apologize for existing. The ceremony grinds to a halt. Protocol officers scramble, their scripts useless, their entire ritual revealed for what it has always been, theater designed to sanctify domination. The silence that follows spreads outward like ripples on a still pond. Each second stretches into eternity, an eternity heavy with shattered expectations. Swiss officials stand frozen, clipboards in hand, their carefully engineered choreography derailed by 5 words that have just rewritten the balance of power in the room. Camera operators zoom frantically, their lenses documenting the precise moment when diplomatic theater collides head-on with revolutionary truth. Donald Trump's expression mutates. Confusion, disbelief, and finally a simmering rage. For the first time, American authority has been openly defied in a hall designed to showcase it. The Austrian chandeliers themselves seem to dim, as though even the architecture recoils from the force of African defiance. World leaders lean forward, their faces taut. For decades, they accepted this ritual as unchangeable law. But now, before their eyes, the first crack splits open in that system. Across the African delegations, the air is electric. Some cover their mouths in shock. Others fight to suppress smiles that could destroy their own careers. The president of Ghana grips the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white, as he watches a fellow African live the dream he never dared attempt. French President Macron stiffens, fury rippling beneath his controlled mask, already calculating sanctions to punish Burkina Faso. German Chancellor Scholz whispers urgently to an aide, demanding an explanation for a scenario no diplomatic manual has ever prepared for. The British Prime Minister tugs nervously at his tie, sensing that if other Africans follow Traoré's example, the entire edifice of neocolonial control could crumble within a single generation. Even Vladimir Putin, seated among the Russian delegation, allows himself a rare smile, relishing the chaos unleashed by an African counterpart unafraid of empire. Swiss guards receive frantic instructions in their earpieces. Commanders hesitate, uncertain. Is this a breach of security, or a diplomatic earthquake demanding careful restraint? In television studios worldwide, producers shout over one another. Should they cut the feed, or broadcast this defiance live for billions? Newsrooms erupt in barely controlled chaos. But on social media, the verdict is already decided. The footage goes viral. Across Africa and the diaspora, people watch, share, and celebrate. For the first time in living memory, their dignity has been restored in the global spotlight by a president who refused to kneel. The silence in the hall grows dense, alive, heavy with consequence. Protocol officers huddle, panicked. Their training has no script for the moment African sovereignty stops asking permission to exist. This is no minor disruption. It is the sound of chains breaking. Anyone with ears can hear it, the music of liberation. As Traore stands firm, his mind flashes to a yellowed photograph kept in his presidential office. His grandfather, stiff beside French colonial officers, forced to salute the men who had stolen his land and enslaved his people. That image has haunted him for years, a wound passed down through generations. Today, he redeems it. His refusal to salute Trump is not vanity, not theater. It is the breaking of a cycle, the shattering of a pattern that has humiliated Africa for more than 60 years. The suffering of his ancestors presses against his chest like a physical weight. He feels their voices whisper, "This is why we endured." In his mind, his grandfather's eyes burn through the faded photograph, finally witnessing the day an African chose dignity over diplomacy. The hall around him seems to fade, replaced by the memory of the vow he made at his grandfather's grave. No African child shall ever bow again. This is more than a rejection of protocol. It is the unveiling of the psychological war that has enabled economic plunder. Traore knows what too many African leaders have forgotten, that every bow, every salute, every act of submission feeds the narrative of inferiority. That images of presidents saluting Western powers are weaponized, circulated, and used to convince Africans that subjugation is natural, permanent, inevitable. The aid packages that follow these rituals come bound with conditions that keep nations dependent, their leaders reduced to tax collectors for foreign corporations. By refusing to salute, Traore declares war, not against a man, but against the entire system of neocolonial control. The shock in the hall is not silence alone. It is the realization of empire itself, that its sharpest psychological weapon has just been broken. And yet, the truest reason lies elsewhere, in the eyes of the children of Burkina Faso. Across the nation, they sit before flickering television screens, watching their president live this moment. For them, sovereignty is no longer abstract. It has a face, a stance, a voice that refuses apology. Traore knows every African child who sees this will grow up with new knowledge, that they are not born subordinate, that their leaders need not kneel, that dignity is not negotiable. His refusal to salute is not merely defiance. It is inheritance rewritten. It is a gift to future generations. Those images will spread through classrooms, universities, and households across the continent. Professors will teach from them. Parents will tell their children of the day Africa stood tall. And his own children will never bear the shame of explaining why their father bowed before foreign power. The revolution that began on the streets of Burkina Faso has entered the halls of global power. There is no turning back. This is no longer just protocol. It is personal history, continental liberation, and intergenerational healing converging into one perfect storm. What should have been a bow has become a declaration of independence, not only for Burkina Faso, but for Africa itself. The Swiss organizers continue their frantic consultations, but they fail to grasp that what they are witnessing is not merely a breach of protocol, it is the birth of a new era in African leadership. Traoré's refusal to salute carries the weight of every African who has ever been forced to bow, every child taught that Western approval was a prerequisite for success, every leader who traded dignity for development aid. The silence in the hall becomes the sound of history holding its breath, waiting to see if others will find the courage to follow his example. His grandfather's photograph burns in his memory, but now it carries a different meaning. The promise has been kept. The cycle has been broken. Africa's dignity has been restored. The so-called diplomatic crisis fades into background noise as Traoré's mind drifts back 30 years, to a dusty schoolyard in Ouagadougou, where 8-year-old Ibrahim watched French soldiers march through his neighborhood, as though they owned the very air his people breathed. His teacher, Madame Sankara, gathered the children behind the school's cracked concrete wall, her weathered hands trembling as she pointed to the foreign uniforms strutting past their classroom windows. "Remember this day," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "Remember how they walk through our land, as if we are invisible, as if our sovereignty is a joke they tell at their dinner tables." Young Ibrahim pressed his face against the rough wall, watching the soldiers laugh, while Burkinabe citizens stepped aside like shadows, their eyes fixed to the ground in rehearsed submission. That afternoon, his grandfather found him weeping under the mango tree, his small fists clenched in rage at a world that seemed designed to humiliate his people. "One day, grandson," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of colonial scars. "One day our leaders will stand tall again." The memory shifts forward to his teenage years, when President Compaore hosted a state dinner for French officials who spoke of Burkina Faso as though it were their personal estate. Their laughter echoed through the presidential palace while local ministers nodded like obedient servants. 17-year-old Traoré, working as a server in his white uniform, stood invisible as he watched African leaders compete for French approval like children begging for candy. He listened as they spoke casually of mining contracts and military bases, of how his country's resources would be divided among foreign corporations, while his people lived without clean water or electricity. The French ambassador patted Compaore's shoulder, like a master rewarding a loyal dog. Something hardened in young Ibrahim's chest, steel forged by humiliation. When the evening ended, he stood alone in the palace courtyard staring up at the stars, whispering a vow to ancestors he felt watching from the darkness. "Never again. Never again will we beg for what is already ours." Years later, as a young military officer, Traoré witnessed the devastation of the 2011 Libyan intervention. He watched helplessly as Western powers destroyed Africa's most prosperous nation under the false banner of humanitarianism. At the African Union summit, he saw leaders nod silently while NATO bombs fell on Tripoli, Their failure to defend Gaddafi a brutal revelation of how deeply psychological colonization ran. The images of Libya's destruction seared into his mind. A modern African nation reduced to rubble because its leader dared challenge Western economic dominance. His fellow officers whispered about the need for change, but their conversations always ended in resignation, acceptance of Africa's supposed inferiority. That night, alone in his barracks, Traore opened his journal and wrote, "The day will come when African leaders choose their people over Western approval, when we stop performing submission as though it were our national anthem." The pen felt heavy in his hand as he drew a line beneath those words, unknowingly charting the path that would lead him to this very moment of defiance. All of these memories crystallize into a single truth, the truth that has guided every decision of his presidency, that the psychological chains binding Africa are more powerful than any army, and that only leaders willing to risk everything for dignity can break them. The stunned silence in Geneva mirrors the silence of that childhood schoolyard. But now, he is the one with the power to shatter it. His refusal to salute Trump fulfills promises whispered at his grandfather's grave, shed in his teacher's tears, and carried in the hearts of every African child taught that their leaders must bow to foreign masters. The weight of those moments presses against his chest like a physical force, reminding him this is not about protocol. It is about healing generational trauma through sovereign courage. He stands motionless before the American president, yet within him he feels his 8-year-old self watching from that dusty schoolyard, finally seeing what African leadership looks like when it refuses to apologize for existing. Within minutes of his refusal, social media across Africa erupts like digital fireworks. Hashtags, #AfricanDignity and #TraoreStands trend in 12 languages as millions share clips of the historic defiance. In Lagos, university students pour into the streets carrying banners with his image, chanting songs that transform his diplomatic act into an anthem of liberation. From Cairo to Cape Town, WhatsApp groups light up, each viewing shared with commentary growing more passionate by the hour. In Accra, market vendors abandon their stalls to gather around televisions, their excited voices drowning out BBC anchors struggling to explain this unprecedented act. French news networks scramble to spin the narrative, dismissing Traore as a reckless populist. Meanwhile, African diaspora communities in Paris celebrate loudly, their joy sending shivers through their former colonial rulers. The moment becomes a Rorschach test for global power. Western media frames it as chaos and instability. African eyes see sovereignty finally taking form. Across European capitals, alarm bells ring. Foreign ministers convene emergency sessions, struggling to process the implications of an African leader who refuses to obey rules designed to guarantee submission. In Paris, President Macron calls an urgent cabinet meeting, his advisors scrambling to calculate punishments that won't turn Traore into a martyr capable of inspiring others. In Berlin, industrial leaders bombard the government with warnings, their African mining investments suddenly at risk. In London, the Foreign Office releases a statement urging calm and diplomatic resolution, its carefully measured language masking outright panic. Across the Atlantic, American think tanks unleash rapid-fire analyses branding Traore a destabilizing force, their policy papers reading like blueprints for regime change dressed in academic jargon. Even Switzerland, host to this gathering, finds itself holding a diplomatic crisis that threatens to unravel decades of carefully built neocolonial ties. Yet in the global south, the reaction is entirely different. Excitement pulses from Caracas to Havana, from La Paz to Manila. Leaders recognize the courage it takes to challenge Western diplomatic supremacy. Venezuelan President Maduro calls Traore a brother in the struggle against imperialism, while Cuban diplomats quietly applaud an African who dares where others remain silent. Then the will of their own people. The room absorbs every word like scripture being recited for the first time. Reporters from Paris and Washington shift uncomfortably in their seats, while correspondents from Lagos and Johannesburg nod with barely concealed pride. This is not the Africa they are used to describing. This is not the narrative they are accustomed to shaping. Dignity, Traore continues, his voice unwavering, is not a gift that can be granted by foreign powers. It is the inheritance of our ancestors. It is the blood price paid by generations who endured chains, humiliation, and exploitation so that we might one day stand tall. His words echo through the hall like the tolling of a great bell. Every syllable strikes at the fragile foundations of the global order that has thrived on African submission. Across the continent, radios crackle in crowded marketplaces, in dusty bus stations, in rural villages where electricity is scarce but hope is abundant. Farmers pause from their labor, mechanics put down their tools, mothers hush their children, all straining to catch the words of the man who has transformed protocol into prophecy. In Nairobi, school children repeat his phrases in classrooms like lines of a national anthem. In Dakar, griots weave his defiance into improvised songs that sweep through neighborhoods faster than the evening breeze. In Western capitals, the response is immediate panic cloaked in diplomatic language. Editorials in major newspapers warn of instability and radicalism, code words meant to disguise fear of a continent slipping out of control. Think tanks convene emergency panels to debate the Traore doctrine, struggling to define something that refuses to fit inside their frameworks of power. Television anchors in London and New York lean heavily on words like reckless and provocative, unaware that their attempts to shape the story only feed the fire of African pride. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the celebration becomes unstoppable. Streets overflow with people singing, dancing, and waving flags. A giant mural of Traore, painted overnight on a city wall, declares, "We do not bow." Vendors sell wristbands, posters, and bracelets bearing the same words. Elders who once despaired of seeing genuine independence in their lifetimes wipe tears from their eyes as they whisper blessings for the young leader who has given them back their pride. The Swiss press corps, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment, rushes to reframe their headlines. What began as a breach of protocol is now recognized as the spark of a continental awakening. The symbolism of a simple refusal has grown into something larger than any press release, larger than any diplomatic communique. It has become the embodiment of a new African century. Traore closes his speech with a declaration that no interpreter struggles to translate. We are equals. We are sovereign. We are unbowed. And from this day forward, the world will meet Africa not as a servant, but as a partner. The hall erupts, not with applause from diplomats, who remain stunned and silent, but with a roar of African journalists, clapping and chanting as though the walls themselves might break under the weight of their joy. In that instant, the balance of history shifts. Geneva, a city built on centuries of managing European power, becomes the unlikely birthplace of Africa's loudest rebirth. Traore does not smile, does not bask in the moment. He simply folds his papers, steps back from the podium, and walks off stage, his refusal complete, his promise fulfilled. The world has no choice but to follow. Then African prosperity. When African presidents salute Western leaders, he explains, his voice growing stronger with each word, they are not just performing ceremony. They are reinforcing the mental colonization that makes economic exploitation possible. The assembled journalists scribble frantically, recognizing that they are documenting the intellectual framework for a new era of African leadership, one that prioritizes dignity over development aid. His words cut through decades of diplomatic doublespeak, exposing how seemingly innocent ceremonial acts serve as psychological weapons that maintain Western dominance over African resources. The message resonates across continents. True sovereignty requires not just political independence, but the courage to reject the rituals that legitimize ongoing exploitation. But the deepest truth of Traoré's message lies in its generational implications. He speaks directly to young Africans, who have grown up watching their leaders bow to foreign powers, while their own potential remains untapped. I refuse to salute because I want African children to grow up knowing that their leaders kneel only to God and stand only for their people, he declares, his words carrying the emotional weight of a father protecting his children's future. The press conference becomes a teaching moment for educators across the continent, who suddenly have a concrete example of what sovereignty looks like when it refuses to apologize for existing. His message transforms from diplomatic statement to educational curriculum, offering young Africans a new understanding of their place in the world, based on dignity rather than dependence. The ripple effects extend into universities, where professors who have spent decades teaching colonial psychology finally have a living example of how that psychology can be shattered through acts of principled resistance. This is not just about one moment of defiance. It is about rewiring the African mind to reject the assumption that Western approval is necessary for African success. The true message of Traoré's refusal echoes through history, connecting his act of defiance to the liberation struggles of Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Kwame Nkrumah, leaders who understood that mental decolonization is the prerequisite for economic freedom. His words carry the authority of a man who has already proven that African nations can expel foreign military bases, nationalize their resources, and prosper without Western permission or World Bank loans. The press conference becomes a masterclass in authentic leadership, communicating not through diplomatic jargon designed to obscure truth, but through clear statements that acknowledge the reality of power and the possibility of change. International media outlets struggle to contextualize his message within their frameworks, their inability to comprehend African dignity exposing the depth of their own psychological colonization. As he concludes, Traoré accomplishes something unprecedented. He uses global media to deliver a message of liberation directly to the African masses, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers who have spent decades controlling the narrative of African capability. The message is simple but revolutionary. Africa no longer needs permission to be great, and its leaders no longer need to perform submission to validate their legitimacy. 6 months after Geneva, the Traoré Doctrine has become required reading in political science departments across Africa. Students analyze how a single moment of principled defiance can reshape international relations for generations. The University of Cape Town establishes the Ibrahim Traoré Institute for African Sovereignty, where scholars document the psychological impact of his refusal on young Africans, who now view their leaders through entirely new lenses. In Nairobi, a new generation of political candidates campaigns on platforms of dignity over dependence, their rallying cries echoing the very language Traoré used in Geneva. The African Union Summit in Addis Ababa witnesses unprecedented scenes as younger leaders openly challenge the deferential protocols that have governed continental diplomacy for decades. School textbooks across Africa are rewritten to include the Geneva moment as a turning point in African history, comparable to the independence movements of the 1960s. The psychological shift is measurable. Polling shows a 300% increase in young Africans expressing pride in their continental identity, with Traore's image becoming as iconic as Mandela and Sankara. The economic effects prove even more transformative. African nations began renegotiating trade agreements with the confidence that Western approval is no longer required for survival. Burkina Faso's economy grows by 12% in the year following Geneva, fueled by Chinese investment and expanded trade with other global South nations, who recognize its new international status. The Geneva effect spreads across the continent. Leaders reject exploitative mining contracts, backed by the knowledge that dignity can also be profitable. French corporations report massive losses in Africa as governments demand ownership stakes in their own resources. The psychological framework of neocolonial extraction collapses under the weight of one man's refusal to bow. The World Bank struggles to maintain influence as African nations design alternative financing mechanisms. International development experts watch in disbelief as African economies prosper without the conditional aid they once declared essential. The ripple effects extend far beyond Africa. Liberation movements worldwide adopt Traore's template of principled resistance. His refusal becomes a global symbol of dignity over diplomacy. Latin American leaders cite the Geneva moment when rejecting IMF conditions that would impoverish their populations. The non-aligned movement experiences a renaissance, as smaller nations realize they have witnessed a masterclass in resisting imperial pressure without war. Asian leaders study his example privately, recognizing that psychological independence is the foundation of economic sovereignty in a globalized world. European politicians face growing unrest at home, as citizens demand explanations for policies that kept Africa poor while European corporations grew rich. The Geneva moment becomes a case study in how individual acts of courage can transform global power structures. By the first anniversary, historians already recognize it as the symbolic end of the post-colonial era and the beginning of what African intellectuals call the Dignity Age. The image of Traore standing motionless before Trump, refusing the ritual of submission, becomes as iconic as Mandela's walk to freedom. Both images represent the triumph of principle over power. Powerful revolutions begin not with armies or wealth, but with the simple decision to stand tall in the face of power that demands submission. His courage sparked a continental awakening that continues to reshape global power dynamics. What's your take on this historic moment? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.